your Godzilla of the truth in America, trucking it every day. Liz Peek coming up momentarily. We're going to have a lot of fun today. Meantime, protests going on. If you work in the Trump administration and you're being harassed, well, that's according to Cory Booker running for president, Maxine Waters and Louis Gutierrez and many other Democrats. Well, that's just fair fodder. Like, if you want to support this president and you want to go out to eat, you're going to be harassed. You're going to get tossed out. You're going to get thrown out. Your kids are going to be mocked and your life is in danger. I guess that's the next step. I don't really know. Good thing we have concealed carry. That's all I can say. It is unbelievable. It's not even a lack of civility. Can you imagine? Just extrapolate this out. Let's go back to 10 or 2013. Let's go back 5 years. And if this was happening to Obama administration officials, I mean, the legacy media their heads would be exploding off. Yet this happens to people that support the president and work in the administration, and the legacy media is cheering them on. It's really an incredible scene in America that we have this today. And the Democrats are overplaying their hands. It's going to backfire again. Joining us now, Liz Peek. She is a noted columnist for The Hill. You can also follow her at lizpeek.com. Liz, great to have you with us.
Good morning. I'm happy to join you.
Liz, what do you make of this? Kirstjen Nielsen, Stephen Miller, Sarah Huckabee, employees of the White House, of the federal government. They can't go out to eat. They can't walk the street. They're being harassed. They can't go to bed at night. They have to stay in a hotel. People screaming at them, banging drums, throwing them out of places. What do you make of this, Liz?
Well, it is an unbelievably ugly scenario. And the last time I remember things like this was when the banking industry got into trouble and bankers were being harassed in their front yards, et cetera. I think that in this case, Trump derangement syndrome is sort of like a virus, and it has now spread to people working for Donald Trump. And it's really horrifying to me, because the bottom line is that these people on the left do not want our government to function. I mean, that has really been, coming from the top. I mean, I don't think it's any more civil of Chuck Schumer to hold up nominations of people who want to work and have been tapped to work in the Trump White House than it is to stand and yell at Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I mean, the message is the same. This is a duly elected president, but we don't like him, and we're not going to let him be our president. So, to your point, it is inconceivable, truly inconceivable, that anyone on the right would have done this sort of thing when Obama was president. You would have been branded a racist, number one, immediately. But also, conservatives are just too darn polite. We just don't do this kind of thing. I mean, honestly, John, remember the week after the election of President Trump, people thronging the streets in New York and other cities protesting what? A duly elected president. I mean, it was ridiculous.
You know what? It's interesting that you say that. You kind of go back to that. And we had kind of forgotten about that. I mean, we had protests. The guy had done nothing. He just got inaugurated, right? And you had this massive protest, right? The Pink Hat protest for 2 days, right? Saturday and Sunday. Yeah. This massive protest for 2 days. And like, he hadn't done anything. So it's, again, you get back, like, so what were they protesting? The fact that their candidate didn't win?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what happens.
I think the problem is they have been egged on by, let's face it, our entertainment community, and by a lot of, people who pretend to be comics or whatever, but are basically sort of liberal mouthpieces, and they have no standards whatsoever. They can use any language they like, and so if you have people like that who are visible and famous, and they have big Instagram accounts, etc., and they're setting the bar lower and lower and lower, it is not so unexpected that average people are going to fall in line. But, I mean, and look, I mean, let's face it, a lot of people think that Donald Trump started us down this path by attacking people during the primary, calling them names, et cetera, et cetera. But I have to say, I don't think he's ever, I mean, I don't know, someone's probably going to take me up on this, but I don't think he has ever sort of descended to this sort of vilification, this personal vilification of people he considers personal political enemies and everybody around them. I mean, let's also face it, this attack on Trump's family is unprecedented as far as I know. The horrible things said and written about Melania Trump and about the kids in his family, it's extraordinary. And I think America really needs to watch out here. I mean, this is what leads to the shootings of GOP representatives playing baseball, right? This sort of unbridled anger and feeling that you can act out because you are righteous, because you are on the side of righteousness. It's wrong.
Well, on Saturday, Maxine Waters, congressman from Los Angeles, who was completely out of control, said, we can do all this because God is on our side.
Yeah.
I mean, you start saying that, and I think you're right, Liz. You give people a false sense of righteousness that I can do whatever I need to do, and, it turns into violence. I think that's what people are concerned about right now. Saturday, Sarah Huckabee and her family gets tossed out of the Red Hen in Lexington, by the way, home of VMI football, where I do the football game, so I'm quite familiar with the Red Hen. I've eaten there. I will never eat there again, ever. But, you go from that to what's next. You got Maxine Waters jumping up and down, saying that we have to confront the evil. What the hell does that mean?
Well, look, they don't like... Look, there's just unbelievable hypocrisy and distruth, untruth, whatever, on the left about everything to do. I mean, the purported instigator here is President Trump's policy of separating families to basically shore up the zero tolerance approach that they were taking at the border. And look, at the bottom line, John, the immigration situation we have is a complete disaster, and everybody knows it. In fact, of course, Jay Johnson made those now famous remarks over the weekend that we had the same problem in the Obama administration, and they did. I remember documenting the things that went on when you had tens of thousands of unaccompanied kids coming to the border, and no one had any idea what to do with them. And if you remember, the video clips of those encounters went viral, and America was aghast. Well, America remains aghast because we have not solved the problem. We don't know what to do. Now, interestingly, and I wish people would occasionally read the newspaper, what's going on in Europe, Austria has proposed that asylum seekers to the EU have a other place other than the EU where they apply. And by the way, I think that's a very reasonable idea for us. Set up places in Mexico, in Canada, where if you are an asylum seeker, you can apply for asylum to the U.S., and let that be the only place you can apply for asylum. And what does it prevent? It prevents people putting a foot inside our country where thereby they are now in our country. Don't let them in. And that is the only way to really deal with this.
Well, the Democrats and the liberals don't want that because they're looking for an open borders, no borders situation. Right now, Liz Peek, we have 325 legal ports of entry in the borders of the United States. 80 of those are along the southern border. Basically, we have one every 30 miles. So my point has been this. If you have traveled across multiple countries, and by the way, any of those countries you navigated your way through and you're seeking asylum, you could have stopped at the U.S. Embassy in any of those major cities, right? Just said, I want asylum. You would not be separated. You would be processed. You'd be fed. You'd be clothed. You'd be there. You'd be in there. They would find housing for you because that's the law. If you want to get to the border, you could have gotten there. Now you've traveled 1,000 miles over dangerous terrain, navigating your way through very difficult situations with kids in tow. You get to the border, every 30 miles there is a legal port of entry. All you have to do is find it. You've got 1,000 miles. You can probably go another 25. You can figure it out. You get to the port of entry. You go there. You say, I'm seeking asylum. You are taken in. You are processed. Your family is not separated. You are housed.
Yeah, look.
That's all you have to do.
There are solutions to this, and it's inconceivable that the United States will not come up with a solution. And by the way, I don't think the Trump administration has done very well by itself here. They may have had the right idea, but the lack of planning at the end of the day, what America hates more than anything else, left or right, is incompetence. And I have to say, it seemed to me pretty extraordinarily incompetent to have this situation arise, not anticipate the blowback that they were going to get, and then not have a solution. I mean, I'm really pretty offended by the way this whole thing went down, and I think a lot of Americans feel the same way.
Well, it was not handled well, no question about it. You know, when they implemented this, they did it as a deterrent, and they thought, you know, a couple of them will see this, and then they'll just stop coming, and it was actually the opposite.
I hope. That would be, John,
well, that's the hope.
You know, and by the way, Obama did that too, if you recall. He actually did try to send a message. I mean, in fact, he sent Joe Biden, of all people, down to Central America to talk about the fact that we were not going to let these kids in. And there is a lesson there. I mean, we need to, and I think Trump was on the right trajectory on that in terms of telling people, this is our new policy, we're not going to let you in, don't even try. That is, at the end of the day, probably the only way that people stop coming to the U.S. But, you know, I don't know. It just, I'm ready for Congress or some group to actually start to tackle our immigration policy, because it is a horrifying nightmare.
Well, they're not going to do it, Liz, because
I know.
They're not going to do it, Liz, because of the unholy alliance between both parties. Yep. The Republicans that simply want cheap labor and lower wages, so they look the other way and they back catch and release, which is not a policy. Catch and release is basically just a no borders, open borders situation.
That's true. That is true. 97% don't show up for their court hearing. I mean, you know, really, it's and then if you try to arrest somebody who's in the country illegally, you have people protesting and calling you a Nazi. So it's just honestly, at some point, as I say, Americans have got to demand better on this, because this is really not functional.
Well, we're going to have to make this into a campaign issue, and you're going to have to decide going to the midterms whether you want a country with the southern border or not. And if you don't, then the Democrats should be honest about it. They should campaign on a no border situation, because they've already called for the elimination of ICE, of that whole organization. And the Republicans that are slaves to the big donors in lower Manhattan that want lower wages and cheap labor should be honest about that too, and said, look, we're for open borders because they give us the money. And they're a lobbyist, and we need that to keep getting reelected and get our big offices and keep our power. So that's why we all look the other way and do catch and release. You know, it's amazing. You just gave a statistic. You said 97% of people that have to show up for court do not show up. Is that a fact that you have? Do you have evidence of that?
Yeah, that's actually the number. Isn't that astonishing? You know, they basically just fade into the background, and they become part of communities that are pretty used to avoiding legal entanglements, let's say, and avoiding ICE agents, and somehow they kind of manage. And look, we all know they're all over the country. Whatever the number is, 11 million or whatever, are here. And, of course, then we have my least favorite immigration policy, which is birthright citizenship, so that the minute they come in, if they choose to have a child, that child is then, by law, a citizen and can bring relatives into the country alongside them. So that is dysfunctional. No one is talking about getting rid of that, although I think President Trump has mentioned in the past it's a terrible policy. We're one of only 2 countries now that actually offer that. It is a relic of a bygone age. And in the olden days, when people were sane about immigration, even Harry Reid talked about getting rid of birthright citizenship, because it is the number one magnet attracting people to this country, and it should be dispensed with.
What's the other country that abides by that list?
I think it's Canada.
I think it is also.
Yeah.
You know, what is also amazing with that is Anderson Cooper last week said on his show that 70%, and I was talking about this, like I couldn't find the stat. You just said 97% do not show up, right?
Yeah.
Anderson Cooper said on his primetime show when he was saying, well, what's wrong with catch and release? 70% of the people show up. And like nobody could find that stat. And I thought it was more like 70% do not show up. But what you're saying is only 3% show up.
No, I mean, I have read this numerous times. I will send you a link.
Send me that link.
I'll track that down.
Yeah, I would appreciate that, because we were debating Anderson Cooper, I was on CNN right after him, and I disputed the number, and they were pushing back and saying, no, 70% show up. And I'm like, I've never seen that statistic anywhere.
No, I think they got it backwards.
I do too. And you start with the fact that only 25% are apprehended that come over the border illegally.
Yeah.
So 75% are not even apprehended. And the thing with the people coming over and asking for asylum, Liz, they're coming over and their first objective is to not be apprehended. Their first objective is to go free and elude the authorities, right? It's only after they're caught that they throw up their hands and say, I want asylum, because that's what somebody told them to say. If they truly wanted asylum, they would go to the port of entry and do it the proper way, and then they wouldn't be separated from their children. So the whole thing is, we're not even being honest about it at its inception. They're crossing the border illegally. They broke the law. They don't want to get apprehended. They do get apprehended, 1 out of 4, and then they say, I want asylum, and then Louis Gutierrez says, well, we're separating them when they're asking for asylum, and that's just horrible. But that's just a lie. Yeah. And they get away with it.
The whole thing from soup to nuts is just sort of a catastrophe, honestly. Everything about and anyway, I mean, you and I could go on forever, and I think agree on what needs to be done, the kind of bills that should be passed. I very much approve of this notion of breaking down these big bills into swallowable bites, and one swallowable bite is getting rid of the diversity lottery, for example. Good. Let's just agree, vote, get rid of it, and then move on to the next horror in our immigration policy. But take it bite by bite, and, we might actually get something done. But as you point out, there are too many vested interests to really get anything done, and that is a tragedy.
It's tough in Washington, Liz. You're in Manhattan. D.C. is different. Your city actually makes things, right? They make garments, they make buildings, they have real estate, they manufacture things. I mean, it's a productive city in America. You go to Washington, Liz, everybody's rich, and they produce nothing, they make nothing, they manufacture nothing, they build nothing, and they produce nothing. But everybody's a millionaire. I don't know how they figured it out. I certainly haven't. Maybe it'll rub off on me. But that's a difference between New York City, where you are now, which actually makes things, and Washington, D.C., which is based on perpetuating the status quo, where people have figured out under the status quo how to make money. And so if you change that, it changes their economic model, and everybody freaks out. And that's really what's happening.